She pressed her dead mother's letter into the scarred cowboy's chest and said, "She spent her last breath writing your name, not mine, yours." Nathan Cole looked down at the letter, looked up at the woman standing in his doorway in the middle of a Montana blizzard, with nothing but a suitcase and 3 weeks of grief on her face. He tried to close the door. She stopped it with her foot. "My mother chose you for me," she said. And Evelyn Carter was never wrong about a man in her life. His hand went still on the door. Something cracked open behind his eyes that hadn't opened in 3 years. Friends, if this story moves you, please subscribe and follow along to the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far my mother's story has traveled. The letter was not long. Evelyn had read it so many times during the journey from Billings that she no longer needed to unfold it to know what it said. Her mother's handwriting was shaky toward the end. The ink pressed harder in some places than others, as if Evelyn Carter had needed the words to stay on the page by sheer force of will. Find Nathan Cole. He lives north of the Judith River past the Callaway Fork. Don't let him turn you away. He will try. He's been turning everyone away for 3 years. Don't let him. Hi is the only man left in this territory who I trust with your life, Evelyn. Not because he is the strongest. Not because he is the wealthiest. Because he is the only man I have ever met who kept a promise when keeping it cost him something. Trust him. Even if he doesn't want to be trusted. Evelyn had stood at her mother's grave in the frozen earth of November and made a silent decision. She would not fall apart. There was no time to fall apart. The ranch her father had built, and her mother had kept alive, was gone stolen in broad daylight by a man named Harlan Voss, who had spent 6 months manipulating documents and bribing the county land clerk after her father's death. She had $31, a small suitcase, and her mother's letter. She had exactly one direction left to go, north. The ride from the nearest town to Nathan Cole's ranch took 2 hours in a rented wagon she could barely afford. The driver, a stocky man named Gus with a gray beard and a habit of spitting over the side, had gone quiet the moment she told him her destination. He didn't say anything for a long stretch. Then he said, "You know Nathan Cole?" "I know of him," Evelyn said. Gus spit again. "Most people don't go out there voluntarily." "Why not?" He scratched under his hat. "Man's not exactly welcoming. Hasn't been since the accident. People went out there a few times after it happened trying to help. He ran every one of them off. Word got around. Nobody bothers anymore." "What kind of accident?" "Cattle crush, 3 years back. Bull went sideways, caught him against the fence post, broke his leg in 2 places. Something happened to his knee that the doctor in town said wouldn't never fully heal right. And his face." Gus paused. "He's got a scar runs from here to here." He drew a finger from below his left eye down to his jaw. "Looks worse than it is, I'd wager, but people out here don't tend to look past the surface." Evelyn listened. She looked at the letter in her lap. She thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table years ago, talking about a young cowboy who had done something her family never forgot. She'd been 12 then. She hadn't paid much attention. She wished now she had paid more. "Is he dangerous?" she asked. Gus thought about that with more care than she expected. "No," he finally said. "No, I don't think he's dangerous. I think he's just done being disappointed." The wagon stopped at the edge of a property that had clearly seen better years. The fence needed repair in at least 4 places she could see. The barn looked solid, but the door hung crooked on one hinge. The main house was 2 stories, built well originally, but the porch boards were warping, and the window shutters on the east side were missing entirely. But it was the smoke from the chimney that made her exhale. He was home. Gus declined to come closer. He set her suitcase down at the end of the property line and gave her a look that mixed pity with something close to respect. "Good luck to you, miss," he said. And he turned the wagon around. Evelyn picked up her suitcase. She walked to the door. She knocked 3 times. Nothing. She knocked again. Harder. A long silence. Then the sound of uneven footsteps. A pause just on the other side of the door. She had the distinct impression that whoever was standing there was deciding whether to pretend not to be home. She spoke before the door opened. Mr. Cole, my name is Evelyn Carter. My mother was Eleanor Carter. She sent me here. I know you don't know me, and I know you didn't invite me, and I'm going to ask you to open this door anyway." Another silence. Then the bolt slid back. The door opened 6 inches. One eye looked at her through the gap. Dark brown, sharp, and so thoroughly guarded, it was almost like looking at something behind glass. "Eleanor Carter's dead," the voice said. It wasn't a question. "3 weeks ago," Evelyn said. "She left me a letter. Your name was in it." The door didn't open further. Didn't close either. "What does the letter say?" "It says you're the only man she trusts with my life." The silence that followed, that was a different kind of silence. Something shifted in it. "She was wrong," the voice said. "She was never wrong about people," Evelyn said. "Not once in 52 years." The door opened. Nathan Cole was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he had the look of a man who had been doing something with his hands before she interrupted him. She looked at his face. The scar was there, running exactly where Gus had described, but it wasn't what she noticed first. What she noticed first was that he was looking at her the way people looked at things they had already decided to distrust. And she understood in that moment that whatever he had been through, it had cost him more than the visible damage suggested. "You can't stay here," he said. "I have nowhere else to go." "That's not my problem." "Mr. Cole." "It's not." His voice wasn't cruel. It was flat. The flatness of someone who had explained something too many times. "I'm sorry about your mother. Eleanor was a good woman. But whatever she wrote in that letter, she didn't have the right to send you here. I don't take in strangers. I don't take in anyone. I live alone. I intend to keep doing that." He started to close the door. Evelyn put her foot against the frame. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to take me in. I am asking you to give me 10 minutes. My mother asked me to find you. I crossed 200 miles in the worst November this territory has seen in a decade to do what my mother asked me to do. You can give me 10 minutes. The door stayed where it was. He studied her. She studied him back. Neither of them looked away. Finally, Nathan Cole opened the door all the way and stepped back from it. He didn't say, "Come in." He didn't say anything. But the space was there. She walked through it. The inside of the house was not what she expected either. It was clean. Not comfortable, not decorated, but clean in the way that belonged to a man with disciplined habits. The kitchen table was cleared. The floor was swept. A fire burned in the hearth with the careful containment of someone who didn't leave things to chance. There was a workbench along the far wall with tools laid out in a row, and she could see that he had been mending leather when she knocked a halter from the look of it with a broken buckle he'd been attempting to replace. He did not offer her a seat. He stood near the fireplace with his arms at his sides, and he waited. Evelyn set down her suitcase. She took out the letter. She held it out to him. He didn't take it. "Just tell me what it says." She put the letter down on the table and looked at him directly. "My mother said she trusted you because of what you did 13 years ago. She didn't tell me the details. She said only that when our family was in real trouble, you were the one who helped. Not for thanks, not for payment. You helped because it was right." Something moved through Nathan's expression. It was brief, and he controlled it quickly, but she caught it. A flash of something that might have been memory, might have been pain. "She remembered that," he said. "She never forgot it," Evelyn said. "She talked about it until she couldn't talk anymore." He looked at the fire. His jaw worked slightly, the muscle tightening in his cheek just below where the scar ended. "What do you need?" "I need time," she said. "And I need someone whose word still means something in this county. My family's ranch was stolen. The man who did it is named Harlan Voss. He had documents falsified after my father died, and he walked away with 240 acres of Carter land. I have evidence he used fraudulent records, but evidence doesn't mean anything unless you have somewhere to stand while you present it. I have no standing here. I have no family. I have no money." She paused. "But you have a name. You have a deed. And according to my mother, you have a conscience. Nathan turned from the fire and looked at her for a long moment. What are you asking exactly? She had rehearsed this too. She had rehearsed it until the words felt like something other than humiliation. A temporary arrangement, a practical one, nothing that requires anything from you that you're not willing to give. She kept her voice even. In this territory, a married woman has legal standing that a single woman doesn't. If Harlan Voss thinks I'm connected to this ranch and to your name, he'll have reason to hesitate. It buys me time to gather what I need. She looked at him clearly. I'm asking you to marry me. In name. For a limited time. 6 months at most. In return, I will work. I can see this ranch needs work. I am not afraid of work. When it's done, we dissolve the arrangement, and I walk away. The silence in the room was absolute. Nathan stared at her. She stared back. You are, he said slowly, the most forward woman I have ever encountered in my life. My mother didn't raise me to be timid, she said. She raised me to be practical. Practical, he repeated. He turned back to the fire. She watched his shoulders and the way they carried what he wasn't saying. You don't know anything about me. I know what my mother told me. She knew me a long time ago, before... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Before the accident, Evelyn said quietly. He didn't answer. He picked up the leather halter from the workbench and turned it in his hands, not because he was going to work on it, but because he needed something to hold. People in this county think I'm finished, he said. They think the accident broke something in me that isn't coming back. They stop on the street. They stare. Some of them are kind about it, which is almost worse than the ones who aren't. His voice didn't rise. It just went harder. Harlan Voss is not a man you challenge without consequences. He's got half the county clerk's office in his pocket, and he's been buying goodwill with every rancher from here to the Missouri River for 3 years. If you go up against him with nothing but evidence and nerve, he will destroy you. Then it's a good thing I'm not going up against him with nothing, Evelyn said. I'm going up against him with you. He looked at her. Unless you're afraid of him, she said. She watched something change in his face. It was not anger. It was something older and more complicated than anger. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting without knowing it for someone to say exactly that. Sit down, he said. She sat. I went to the kitchen, and without asking her, he put water on for coffee, and he came back and sat across from her at the table, and he said, Tell me everything you know about what Voss did, all of it. Start at the beginning. And she did. She talked for nearly an hour. She told him about her father's death in the spring of 1886, a fever that took him in 11 days. She told him how Harlan Voss had come to pay his respects, and how she'd thought at the time that he was being neighborly. She told him how the visits continued always to her mother, never when Evelyn was present, and how the documents began to shift. Her mother had been educated, but not in the language of land deeds and county registry systems. She'd trusted the papers placed in front of her, trusting the notary who Voss brought with him, trusting the county clerk who signed without question. By the time Evelyn Carter understood what she'd signed, the transfer was recorded, and Voss's lawyers were quoting chapter and verse. She told him how her mother had spent the last year of her life fighting it. She told him about the lawyers in Billings who'd taken their money and delivered nothing. She told him about the one honest man at the county office who had written a private note suggesting the original transfer documentation had irregularities, but who was too frightened of Voss's reach to say so publicly. Nathan listened to all of it. He asked questions that were precise and specific. The dates, the names, which notary, which clerk, which lawyer. She answered every one. When she finished, the coffee was long cold in her cup, and the fire had burned down considerably. There's a lawyer in Helena named Arthur Cross, Nathan said. He's handled land fraud cases before. He's one of maybe 4 men in this territory. Voss can't buy because Cross has enough of his own money that Voss has nothing to offer him. If your evidence is what you say it is, Cross might take the case. Evelyn felt something move in her chest. It was small and careful, that feeling. She didn't let it show. Do you know him? I know of him, Nathan said. My father used him once years ago. Different matter. But I know the name and I know the reputation. Would you write to him? I'd have to think on that. He looked at the table. About the other thing you said. She waited. The arrangement, he said. She waited. He was quiet for a long moment. She could hear the wind picking up outside, working at the loose shutter she'd noticed on the way in, making it knock against the frame in a slow, irregular rhythm. If I agreed to this, he said, it would be on terms. Name them. No pretense inside this house. We'd be honest with each other in here, whatever we present outside these walls. I don't have patience for performance. Agreed. You'd work for your keep. I'm not a charity. I told you I would. And you'd tell me everything going forward. No managing of information. If something changes with Voss, if you hear something, if something threatens this arrangement, you tell me directly. I don't like surprises. Agreed, she said again. He looked at her with those dark, guarded eyes, and she had the sense he was calculating something she couldn't quite see. You're not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No, she said. Most people are. I'm not most people. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he pushed back from the table, stood up with the slight hitch in his stride she'd noticed when he moved, and went to the window and stood with his back to her. It'll take 3 or 4 days to arrange, he said. There's a preacher in town. I'll send word. A pause. You can have the room at the top of the stairs. The bed's got clean linen. There's a wash basin. Evelyn let out a breath so carefully he didn't hear it. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Nathan, he said. He still didn't turn around. If we're going to do this, you'd better call me Nathan. The 4 days before the wedding were stranger than any 4 days Evelyn had ever lived through. They existed in the house together in a state of careful, deliberate politeness that had the texture of two people navigating around something fragile without acknowledging that the fragile thing was there. He made coffee in the morning before she was up and left her cup on the counter without comment. She found the state of the account ledgers on the 3rd morning and asked if she could look at them. He said nothing for a moment, then said yes. She spent the afternoon with them and discovered the ranch was not as close to collapse as she'd feared. It was mismanaged, not failed, the difference between a wound and a mortal one. She noticed things without meaning to. She noticed that he moved through the house differently when he thought she wasn't watching, with less compensation, less effort to mask the uneven gait. She noticed that he ate standing at the counter until he saw her sitting at the table, and then he sat too, as if he'd forgotten there was another option. She noticed that he worked from before dawn until after dark, and took no rest in between, and she thought about what Gus had said. He's done being disappointed. She thought about what it took to keep working that hard with no one watching and no one to work for. She didn't ask him about the accident. She didn't ask him about his family, or what had happened to his ranch hands, or why a place built for more than one person was occupied by exactly one. She waited. She had learned patience from her, the same way she'd learned everything else by watching a woman do it with grace in difficult circumstances. On the 2nd morning, she went out before breakfast to look at the garden on the south side of the house. It was dead in the November cold, which was expected, but beneath the surface, the soil told a different story. It had been tended before. Carefully, someone had known what they were doing in this ground. She knelt and dug her fingers in and found the remnant of a root structure that hadn't given up entirely. Nathan found her there. He stopped several feet away, looking at what she was doing. She looked up. Who planted this? She asked. He looked at the garden for a moment. My mother, he said. She was here until about 4 years ago. Is she? She went to Livy with my sister in Bozeman. After the accident, she wanted to stay. I made her go. He said it simply, without apparent emotion, but she heard what was underneath it, the decision that had cost him made, because he hadn't wanted anyone to watch him. The root structure is still alive, Evelyn said. I can bring it back in spring. He looked at her. You know gardening. My mother taught me. She said a garden is just stubbornness applied to soil. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite become a smile, but it was the first time she'd seen it move like that. That sounds like Eleanor, he said. The preacher came on a Thursday. His name was Brother Elias, and he was a small, serious man with spectacles and the look of someone accustomed to performing ceremonies for people who were not entirely convinced they wanted to be performing them. He looked between Evelyn and Nathan with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to ask questions about arrangements in frontier territories. They stood in the main room of the house. Brother Elias read the words. They said the words back. When it came time for the ring, Nathan produced one she hadn't expected, a simple band, gold worn smooth, clearly old. He put it on her finger without ceremony, and she looked at it and looked at him and found his expression closed completely. Shut. Whatever the ring meant, locked behind a door she didn't yet have the key to. You may, Brother Elias began. Thank you, brother, Nathan said. I'll see you out. He handed the preacher an envelope and walked him to the door, and they stood on the porch for a moment. Evelyn stood in the room holding her own hand without realizing it, turning the ring slightly with her thumb. When Nathan came back in, she said, "Whose ring is this?" He stopped. He looked at her. For a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My grandmother's. She left it to me." He paused. She said to save it for a woman who looked at me like she wasn't keeping count of my scars. Evelyn felt something catch in her chest. She didn't say anything. She looked back at the ring. You didn't look, he said. When I opened the door, you looked at my eyes. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something raw and carefully restrained, like a fire in a lantern contained but unmistakably burning. My mother told me to, she said. She said the eyes tell you everything the face is trying to hide. He held her gaze for one long, unguarded moment. Then he turned and went back to his workbench, and she heard him pick up the halter again, and the room settled around the sound of his hands working. She looked at the ring. She looked at the fire. She thought about her mother's letter and what it meant to trust something you couldn't quite see yet. And she decided for the first time since she'd stood at that grave in the frozen ground that she had done the right thing. That night, the wind came in hard from the northwest, and the temperature dropped fast enough that she could feel it through the walls. She lay in the room at the top of the stairs and listened to it, and thought about Harlan Voss, about the documents, about Arthur Cross and Helena, about the man sleeping somewhere below her in this house, who had put his grandmother's ring on her finger without explanation, and then gone back to mending leather. She heard him stop moving around midnight. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, the slight drag of the one, the solid fall of the other, and then the quiet of his door closing. She thought he told me not to be afraid. She thought I'm not. She thought I don't know yet if that's wisdom or something else entirely. But she was here. Her mother had asked her to come here. And Nathan Cole had opened the door and let her in, and put his grandmother's ring on her hand, and she had made a promise, practical, specific, limited in scope. Or so she had told herself all the way here on that cold wagon. She looked at the ring in the dark. It didn't feel limited. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't yet found the name for. Outside the wind worked at the loose shutter. Inside the fire burned low in the hearth downstairs. And in the house that had been empty for too long, two strangers lay in separate rooms, and neither of them slept for a very long time. The next morning, Nathan Cole was already dressed and out at the barn when she came down. She made the coffee. She laid out the account ledgers she'd been studying and picked up where she'd left off. She found 3 places where the record-keeping had fallen behind, and 2 places where the cost of supplies had been running higher than necessary. Not through carelessness, she thought, but through the particular inefficiency of a man doing everything alone who hadn't had the time to notice the smaller details bleeding away. When he came in from the barn, she had a cup waiting for him on the counter. He stopped just inside the door, looked at it, looked at her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. She turned back to the ledgers. There's also something you should know about your feed supplier. You're paying 8 cents per unit more than the rate listed at the supply house in town. Either someone adjusted the contract after you signed it, or you've been dealing with an agent who's pocketing the difference. He came to the table slowly and sat down across from her. He picked up the cup. He looked at the numbers she was pointing to. He said nothing for a long moment. How do you know this? He said. My father kept careful records, she said, and I spent 2 years keeping them for him. I know what feed should cost in Montana territory. Nathan looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not quite surprise, not quite respect. Something between them. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. "Settle it with the supply house." "I'll come with you," she said. He paused. "People will stare." "Let them," she said. "If we're doing this, we're doing it properly." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the ledger. "Fine," he said. And he turned the page, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the cold morning light, and they worked. Outside, the winter went on. The wind pressed at the house from every direction. But inside, something small and careful and not yet named had begun. And neither of them said so. And both of them knew. The ride into town. The next morning was the first time Evelyn understood exactly what Nathan Cole had been living inside of for 3 years. They left before the cold had fully lifted the wagon, moving along the frozen road in the gray early light, and for the first stretch, neither of them spoke, which was not unusual. They had already settled into a kind of companionable quiet that felt surprisingly more natural than forced. But when the first buildings of Caldwell came into view, she felt the change in him before she saw it. His shoulders went slightly back. His jaw set. He took the reins a little differently, not tighter, just with a certain deliberate stillness, the way a man holds himself when he expects to be looked at and has decided in advance that he will not react. She understood what that cost. They tied the wagon outside the supply house, and Nathan climbed down first, and she watched him take that first step onto the main street of Caldwell, with the slight drag in his stride that he never quite masked. And she watched 3 people across the street register his presence before they'd registered hers. One of them, a woman in a dark coat, leaned toward the person beside her and said something without looking away. The person she said it to looked too. It took perhaps 4 seconds. Nathan's expression didn't change at all. She fell into step beside him. He pushed open the supply house door, and they went in together. The man behind the counter was heavy-set with reddish hair going gray at the temples, and the slightly startled expression of someone who hadn't expected to see Nathan Cole walk through his door. He recovered quickly, too quickly, and his smile came out wide and a half-second too late. "Nathan," he said. "It's been a while." "Dan Todd," Nathan said. He set the ledger page Evelyn had copied out onto the counter. "I need to talk to you about the feed contract." Dan looked at the paper. He looked at Evelyn. He looked back at the paper. "Who's this, May? My wife," Nathan said. She felt the word land in the room. Dan's eyes went to her hand to the ring and back up to her face, and she watched him recalibrate everything he'd been about to say. "You're—" He stopped. "I hadn't heard. We didn't advertise it," Nathan said. "The contract, Dan." Dan looked at the numbers she'd written out. She watched his face carefully. He was a man who had been skimming and knew it, and was now calculating how much Nathan knew. He pulled at the collar of his shirt. "There might have been some adjustment for the winter rate," he said. "Transport costs go up when the ground freezes." 8 cents per unit, Nathan said. "Consistent through summer. There's no transport adjustment that runs through summer, Dan." A long pause. "The contract," Nathan said again, quieter this time. Quieter was worse. She could tell Dan understood that. "I'll adjust the billing," Dan said. "You'll issue a credit for the full overage," Nathan said. "The amount is listed at the bottom of that page." Dan looked at the number. His face did something complicated. Then he pulled out his own ledger and started writing. He didn't argue. He wrote the credit, signed it, slid it across the counter, and didn't look at either of them again. Nathan took the paper. He nodded once. He turned and held the door for her, and they walked out. On the street in the winter air, she heard him let out a slow, controlled breath. "You knew he was skimming," she said. "I suspected," he said. "For about a year. I didn't have the numbers laid out clearly enough to say it to his face." She thought about what it had cost him this past year to suspect something and not be able to name it. To be one man doing 6 men's work with no one to check his calculations. She didn't say any of that. She said, "You should have a second ledger, independent. I'll keep it." He looked at her sideways. "You're volunteering to manage my accounts." "I'm managing them already," she said. "I started last night." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she realized and turned back to look at him. He was standing on the frozen street, looking at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant something had gotten past his guard without his permission. "You are a deeply unusual woman," he said. "So my mother always told me," she said. "Come on. I want to look at the county records office while we're here." He didn't move immediately. "What for?" Harlan Voss filed his transfer claim through this county. The original Carter deed should still be in the registry records, whatever version they have of it. I want to see what Voss's filing actually says. Nathan looked at the records office down the street, a narrow building with the county seal painted above the door. His expression shifted. "The clerk in there is a man named Peterson. He's been in Voss's pocket since before my accident." "I know," she said. "I don't need his help. I just need to look at a public document, which by law he is required to show me." "He'll make it difficult." "He can try," she said. He studied her for a moment longer. Then for the second time, she saw that almost smile at the corner of his mouth. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The county records office smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room that was kept locked more than it was opened. The clerk, named Peterson, was a thin man of about 50, with the look of someone permanently aggrieved by the requirements of his position. He looked up when they came in, and his face went through the same sequence Dan's had: recognition, recalibration, and then something colder when he understood why they were there. "Mrs. Cole," Evelyn said before he could speak, "I need to review the registry records for the Carter land transfer, filed spring of 1886, original deed and transfer documentation." Peterson looked at her. He looked at Nathan. "That's not a simple request. Records retrieval requires... It requires that you retrieve a public document for a citizen who has asked for it," Evelyn said. "I believe that's the full extent of the requirement." A pause. "I'll need to check if those records are available," Peterson said. "They're available," Nathan said. His voice had that quiet quality again. "They're public registry documents. They've been available since the day they were filed." Peterson's jaw tightened. He turned and went to the back room. "I was in there for 8 minutes." Evelyn counted. Nathan stood beside her without moving, and she was aware of his presence, the way you were aware of something solid and steady in a room full of things that shifted. Peterson came back with a folder. He put it on the counter. He did not open it. She opened it herself. She spent 12 minutes reading. Nathan read over her shoulder. Neither of them said anything. She had brought a small notebook, and she copied 3 specific passages. The notary signature. The witness names the date stamp on the county acknowledgement. She copied them carefully and precisely, and when she was done, she closed the folder and pushed it back across the counter. "Thank you," she said. Peterson said nothing. They left. Outside, half a block from the records office, she turned to Nathan and said, "The witness signature on the transfer document is a man named Gerald Finch." "I know that name," Nathan said. "So do I," she said. Gerald Finch died in April of 1885, a year before the document was supposedly signed. Nathan stopped walking entirely. She watched it land, watched him understand what she was saying. "That means the document is forged," she said. "The witness didn't witness anything because the witness was a dead man." She paused. "Harlan Voss didn't just manipulate documents, he fabricated them." Nathan looked at her steadily. "Can you prove Gerald Finch was dead before that date?" "Death records are public," she said. "I need the Billings County Register. I need someone to pull the death record and certify it." She paused. "I need Arthur Cross." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll write to him tonight." She let out a breath. One careful, quiet breath. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Voss is going to hear we were in that records office before sundown. Peterson will see to that." He looked back toward the building. "We just told Voss we're coming." "Good," she said. He looked at her. "I want him to know," she said. "I want him nervous." She turned and walked toward the wagon. "Come on. I want to be back before dark." He stood there for another second watching her go, and then he followed. And she didn't see his expression when he did, which was a good thing, because it was the expression of a man who had just realized he'd agreed to something considerably larger than a practical arrangement, and he was not yet sure what to do about that. They drove home in the late afternoon dark, with the wind coming up again, and somewhere past the Callaway Fork, he said, without looking at her. You should know that what you found today, if Cross takes the case and files on it, Voss will not accept it quietly. He'll push back. Hard. I know. He's pushed back on people before. A family east of here tried to challenge him 2 years ago. They were gone inside of 3 months, sold up for nothing and left. Were they alone? She said. He paused. Yes. Then the difference, she said, is that I'm not. He didn't answer that, but he didn't look away from the road either, and she heard something change in his breathing. Just slightly. Just enough. She looked ahead of the dark road and thought of her mother's letter, and thought, I trust him. She had not expected to this quickly. She had expected the arrangement to feel like what it was, a transaction, a strategy. It did not feel like that. It felt like something she hadn't had words for since the day her mother died, since the day the ranch disappeared, and the lawyers failed, and the world closed in from all directions. It felt like standing on solid ground. She was not naive enough to confuse that with love. Not yet. But it was something. And she held it carefully, like you held a match in the wind. They reached the ranch as the last light went out of the sky, and Nathan took the horses to the barn, and she went inside and put the fire up and started supper without thinking about it, as if she'd been doing it for years, as if this kitchen were hers, as if this house already knew her shape. When he came in from the cold and smelled the stew, and stopped in the doorway with that expression she was learning, the guarded one, the one that barely let things through, she thought he hasn't had someone cook for him in a very long time. She said nothing about it. She put 2 bowls on the table and sat down, and he sat across from her, and they ate. And outside the Montana winter pressed at the windows, and inside the fire was warm, and the food was hot, and neither of them said much. But it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was something else. Something quieter, and more careful, and considerably more dangerous. She thought she should probably be worried about that. She decided to worry about it later. Nathan wrote to Arthur Cross that night. She heard the scratch of his pen from across the house. He had taken the letter to the small desk in what he called the back room, which was half storage and half the kind of catch-all space that accumulated in houses where someone lived alone without reason to organize. She'd glanced in there once. There were boxes, a child's chair in the corner that she hadn't asked about, a shelf of books that were well read, the spines cracked and familiar. She waited in the main room with the account ledger and her notebook, going over the numbers she'd copied from the county office, fitting pieces together. She was building a picture, and the picture was getting clearer the more she looked at it. When Nathan came back in, he had the letter sealed. He set it on the table between them. I told him the bare facts, he said. The witness date discrepancy, your mother's name, the original deed. I said you'd retain documents. He paused. I didn't tell him about the arrangement. That's fine, she said. Cross doesn't know me well. He knew my father. I said enough that he'll take the letter seriously. She nodded. She looked at the letter. She looked at him. Nathan, what you said earlier about the family that left, the ones who tried to fight Voss and were gone in 3 months. He sat down. What about them? Do you know what happened to them specifically? I was quiet for a moment. Their livestock started dying, one at a time. Then a section of their fence came down and they lost their cattle on the range. Then their barn caught fire. He looked at the table. It was ruled accidental. She let that sit. He didn't just steal the land, she said. He broke people until they gave up. Yes. He's going to try to do that to me. Yes, Nathan said again. He's going to try to do that to us. He said it simply with no drama, and that simplicity was somehow the most significant thing he'd said yet. Us. He'd said it like a fact, like it had already been decided. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hands on the table, the scarred knuckles, the workman's hands, the hands of a man who'd rebuilt things alone for 3 years. Why did you agree to this? She said. It came out before she'd measured it. Really. Not the practical reasons. You could have sent me away. Most men would have. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Your mother." She waited. 13 years ago, he said. I was 20 years old, and I'd made a very bad decision. Not a criminal one, but a bad one. I'd borrowed money I couldn't repay from a man who wasn't patient. I was out of options, and I was too proud to tell my father. Your mother found out. I don't know how. She never told me how. She came to me, and she said, "I know about the debt, and I know about the man you owe it to, and I'm going to help you." He looked at his hands. I told her I didn't need help. She said that was not relevant to her offer. Evelyn felt something warm and painful move through her chest. That was her mother exactly. That was Evelyn Carter to the bone. She lent me the money, he said. No interest, no conditions except that I pay it back when I could, which I did every cent 2 years later. She never told my father. She never told anyone. He paused. After the accident, when people started treating me like something to pity or avoid, I kept thinking about what she'd said that day when I tried to turn her help down. He stopped. What did she say? Evelyn asked. She said, Nathan, the only people who never need help are the ones who've never been tested yet. He looked up. I thought about that a lot these past 3 years. When I was trying to manage this ranch alone, when I was convincing myself I was fine. I thought about Evelyn Carter and what she would say to me if she could see me. A pause. Probably something very similar to what you said when you put your foot in my door. Evelyn laughed. It was small and surprised and real, and she hadn't laughed since before her mother died, and the sound of it seemed to startle Nathan as much as it startled her. He looked at her, and something crossed his face, not quite the almost smile, something more open than that, something that had more of the actual man in it. She was remarkable, Evelyn said. Yes, he said. She was. They sat with that for a moment. The fire burned. Outside, the wind went on doing what Montana wind did in November, which was everything it wanted without apology. Get some sleep, Nathan said finally. Tomorrow I need to fix the fence on the north section before the next storm comes in. I could use another set of hands. She raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to fix fences? I'm telling you to get some sleep so you can help me fix fences, he said. Those are different things. She stood up. She took the ledger with her. At the door to the hall, she paused. Nathan. He looked up. She chose you well, Evelyn said, simply, clearly. My mother. She chose well. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. And when she went up the stairs, she heard him sit at the table for a long time afterward, not moving, just sitting. And she understood that sometimes the things that moved through a person most deeply were the ones that left no sound at all. 3 days later, the rumors started. She heard about it first from the woman who ran the dry goods store in Caldwell, a forthright woman named Mrs. Hannigan, who appeared to view gossip as a public service. Evelyn had gone into town alone to purchase thread and some supplies, and Mrs. Hannigan had leaned over the counter with the particular posture of someone delivering intelligence they considered important. I want you to know, Mrs. Hannigan said, that I don't subscribe to what's being said. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. What's being said? That you married Nathan Cole because you have designs on his property. That you came here from Billings with debts of your own, and this was a scheme to attach yourself to his deed. Mrs. Hannigan watched her face carefully. Margaret Briggs said she heard it directly from the county clerk's wife, Peterson. Evelyn thought it immediately. Peterson had gone to Voss within hours of their visit, exactly as Nathan had predicted, and Voss had moved fast and moved smart. If you couldn't discredit the evidence, you discredited the person bringing it. She bought her thread. She thanked Mrs. Hannigan for telling her. She drove home. Nathan was in the barn when she got back. She unhitched the horse herself and led it in and started telling him before he'd even turned around. He listened to all of it. His expression went very still, and she recognized that stillness now. It wasn't calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was the way he looked when something hit the wound he kept covered. He's trying to make you look like a con artist, he said. He's trying to make both of us look foolish, she said. Me for running a scheme, you for falling for it. He's using the oldest weapon there is, making people doubt your own judgment. Nathan was quiet. People will believe it, he said. Not bitterly, just factually. People around here, they've been looking for a reason to... He stopped. Started again. When you're already considered broken, people don't need much evidence to decide you've made another mistake. She looked at him directly. Do you believe it? He turned and looked at her. What? Do you believe I came here for your property? Something moved in his eyes. No. Then that's what matters, she said. We know what's true. Voss is going to push. He's going to push harder than this. The question isn't whether people talk. The question is whether we let it stop us. He held her gaze. No, he said again. Good. She turned to go back to the house. Then she stopped. She turned back. Nathan, when we go to town from now on, we go together. Not because I need protection, because I want them to see us together. I want them to look at us and see two people who are not embarrassed and are not afraid. That's the answer to rumors. He stood in the barn, looking at her with that expression she couldn't yet fully name. You think about strategy constantly, he said. My mother's daughter, she said. He almost smiled. It was almost a real one this time. She went back to the house, and she did not let herself think about what that almost smile was doing to the practical limited arrangement she had walked through his door with. Almost. The letter from Arthur Cross arrived 11 days later. It came on a Tuesday, delivered by the weekly mail rider, and Nathan brought it in and set it on the table in front of her without a word. They looked at it together. Then she picked it up and opened it. Cross's handwriting was compact and very precise, the handwriting of a man who charged by the hour and wasted no one's time. She read it through once, then again, and then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table. He'll take the case, she said. Nathan, who had been watching her face, read the letter, let out a breath. What does he need? A certified copy of Gerald Finch's death record. A certified copy of the original Carter deed, the one before Voss's transfer, which would be held in the Billings County Registry, not here. And an affidavit from the honest man at the county office, the one who sent my mother the private note. The one who's afraid of Voss. Yes. Will he sign an affidavit? She looked at the letter again. Cross says if we can get him to agree to meet, Cross will come here to take the statement himself. He says he has some experience with witnesses who are reluctant. She looked up. He also says... She paused. What? She looked at the letter carefully. He says Harlan Voss has done this before. Not to us. To other families. He says he's had 3 cases in 5 years involving Voss and forged records, and in 2 of them the family settled before it reached court. She paused. He says he has material he's been building for 2 years, waiting for a case strong enough to make it stick. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He's been waiting for someone to go the distance. Yes, she said. Most people don't. I know. He looked at her. She looked back. And the thing between them that had no name and no agreed-upon shape settled in the room like something that had decided to stay. I'll ride to Billings next week, he said. The original deed. I'll come with you, she said. It's a 2-day ride in this weather. I know. Evelyn. Nathan, she said with the quiet patience of her mother. I have been managing my own travel for 2 months in the worst Montana winter in a decade. I can manage 2 days. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, and lived in the complicated country between the two. Fine, he said. But we leave at first light, and you dress for the cold. I dress for the cold, she said. They planned it that evening at the kitchen table, the fire burning warm and the map spread out between them. Their heads bent close together over the route, her finger tracing one line, while his traced another, and at some point she became aware of how close they were, how the space between them had been reducing for days without announcement, how the house that had felt like a transaction was beginning to feel like something she did not yet have the right word for. She focused on the map. I was talking about a road through the lower valley that stayed drier in winter, and she was listening genuinely, listening and also aware in the back of her mind of the ring on her hand and the grandmother who'd left it to him, and what he'd said, save it for a woman who looked at me like she wasn't keeping count of my scars. She hadn't been counting. She'd seen his eyes first. She still did. She looked at the map and said nothing about any of it. But when he reached across to point at the valley road, and his hand came near hers on the map, neither of them moved away. And neither of them mentioned that either. Outside, the Montana night was long and cold, and absolutely indifferent to the careful, complicated, entirely unplanned thing happening in that kitchen. The wind went on. The stars did what stars in Montana did in November, which was burn with the particular ferocity of things that were very far away and very bright anyway. Inside, two people planned a journey. And something that had begun as a promise made to a dead woman was becoming quietly and without permission, something neither of them had dared to name. The ride to Billings took 2 days, as Nathan had said, and it was hard travel in the way that honest winter travel always was cold, that worked its way through every layer and settled in the joints roads that had been good in autumn and were treacherous. Now hours of silence broken by conversation that came in fragments and felt each time like something being slowly opened rather than forced. She learned things about him on that ride that she wouldn't have learned in a month at the ranch. She learned that he'd grown up on the Cole property, that his father had built the main house with 4 other men. The summer Nathan was 7 years old, that he could name every beam and board in that structure from memory, because he'd watched it go up plank by plank and had been handed nails to hold, and had felt at 7 the particular pride of a boy included in a man's work. She learned that he'd had a younger brother who'd gone to California in 1879 and sent letters for 2 years and then stopped, and that Nathan didn't know whether he was alive or dead, and had decided somewhere along the way to stop wondering about it because the wondering was worse than the not knowing. She told him things too. About her father, who had been a quiet, careful man who loved her mother with the kind of devotion that announced itself in small things, the way he always knew how she took her coffee, the way he stopped whatever he was doing when she walked into a room, not out of obligation, but out of the simple fact that she was the most interesting thing in it. She told him about the morning her father had gotten sick, how he'd been fine at breakfast and wrong by midday, and gone by the end of the second week, and how the speed of it had felt like a kind of violence, like something had been taken before she'd had a chance to brace. Nathan was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "The accident. People think it changed me because of the leg, because of my face." He kept his eyes on the road. "It wasn't that." She waited. "I was on the ground," he said, "after the cattle came through, and I could hear people nearby, ranch handsmen I'd worked alongside for 4 years, and nobody came." He paused. "For about 3 minutes nobody came. I know now they were trying to move the animals to make it safe to get to me. But I didn't know that then. What I knew lying there was that I was alone." His hands tightened slightly on the reins. Something decided in those 3 minutes that that was the truth of things, that you were always alone, that the distance between you and other people was the only honest part of the whole arrangement. Evelyn looked at his profile, at the scar, at the line of his jaw, and the way he held his head when he said difficult things, straightforward facing, as if he'd decided that honesty required you to look at the horizon when you delivered it. "And now," she said. He glanced at her, glanced away. "I'm reconsidering," he said. It was such a simple thing to say, and it landed in her chest like it weighed 10 pounds. She looked at the road ahead and said nothing. And the wagon went on through the Montana cold, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was the best kind of silence, the kind that didn't need filling because it was already full. Billings was bigger than Caldwell, by enough to feel like a different country. The streets were the buildings crowded together, and the county registry office was on the second floor of a building that smelled of ink and warm wood and the accumulated paper of decades of record-keeping. The clerk there was a young woman named Miss Ellard, who had none of Peterson's guarded loyalty to anyone's pocket, and who found the Carter deed in 40 minutes, and produced a certified copy with the brisk efficiency of someone who took her job seriously. Evelyn held the certified copy in both hands and read it through carefully, and then looked up at Nathan, who was watching her with his arms crossed, and that steady attention she'd gotten used to in a way she probably should have been more careful about. "The original deed is clean," she said. "My father's name, my mother's name, 240 acres, notarized correctly. Witness signatures that match living people who were in the county at the time of signing. She looked at him. This is the real document, which means everything Voss filed is measured against this, and it doesn't match. Cross can work with that, Nathan said. Cross can destroy him with that, she said. They got the certified copy registered and witnessed, and then they needed somewhere to stay the night before the ride back. Nathan had arranged a room at a boarding house on the north side of town. 2 rooms. He'd been careful about that, which she noticed without commenting on, and they had supper at a small restaurant down the street where nobody knew either of them, and nobody stared, and it was... She realized halfway through the meal the first time she'd eaten in a public place without being aware of how they looked to other people. She said as much without planning to. He looked up from his plate. What do you mean? In Caldwell, she said. When we're in town, I'm always aware of it. How we look together. Who's watching. I spend energy on it without meaning to. She paused. Tonight I forgot to do that. He was quiet for a moment. Is that good or bad? She thought about it honestly. Good, I think, she said. Mostly. Mostly, he repeated. It means I'm getting comfortable, she said. And comfortable it's a thing I have to be careful about, given the circumstances. He looked at her steadily. Given the arrangement. Yes. He turned his fork over in his hand. It was a habitual gesture. She'd noticed he did it when he was deciding whether to say something. Evelyn, can I ask you something directly? You can always ask me directly, she said. Do you still think of it as an arrangement? The question sat in the air between them. She looked at him. He was looking at her with those dark eyes that had stopped pretending to be guarded quite so thoroughly, and the firelight from the restaurant's hearth caught the line of his scar, and she thought not for the first time that she had genuinely stopped seeing it as a flaw somewhere in the second week. It was just his face, just Nathan. I think of it as something that started as an arrangement, she said carefully. And I'm honest enough to say I don't know exactly what it is now. He held her gaze. That's an honest answer. You asked for honest. I did, he said. He looked back at his plate. He turned the fork over one more time. I don't think of it as an arrangement, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever you decide it is for you, I haven't thought of it that way for about 2 weeks. She felt something move through her that was too large and too warm and too inconvenient for the moment, and she managed to keep it off her face mostly. Nathan. You don't have to say anything back, he said. I'm not asking you to, I just... He paused. You asked me once to be honest with you inside the house. I'm trying to extend that to other buildings. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, That's the most you've said about something personal in one breath since I met you. The corner of his mouth moved. The real one this time, not the almost smile, but the actual one, brief and unguarded there, and then contained again. Don't get used to it, he said. She smiled at her plate. Too late, she said. They rode home the next day, and the certified copy was in her saddlebag, and the letter for Cross was already composed in her head, and somewhere between the Lower Valley Road and the Callaway Fork, she made a decision about the careful, practical, deliberately limited thing she had walked into his house with 23 days ago. She made the decision quietly and without drama, the way her mother had always made decisions that mattered, by admitting simply that the thing she'd told herself was true was no longer the whole truth. She didn't tell him. Not yet. But she stopped arguing with herself about it. They got home as the late sun was going flat and cold behind the hills, and Nathan took the horses, and she went inside and put the fire up and stood in the kitchen of the house that had begun to feel like hers, turning the ring on her finger with her thumb, and she thought Evelyn Carter. You extraordinary woman. You knew exactly what you were doing. She started supper and didn't try to talk herself out of anything at all. The affidavit from the county office man was the next problem, and his name was Robert Cale, and he was more frightened than she'd expected. Nathan drove her to his house on the edge of Caldwell on a gray Thursday morning, and Robert Cale answered the door with the face of a man who'd been expecting something bad to arrive and wasn't surprised that it had finally shown up. He was around 40, with the build of a man who'd spent his working life indoors, and his eyes went past them both the moment they introduced themselves, scanning the road behind the wagon, checking who might have seen them stop. Come inside, he he said quickly. Don't stand on the porch. Inside his house with the door closed, he was no calmer. He stood with his back to the wall near the door, not quite able to bring himself to sit down, and he looked at Evelyn with an expression that held genuine sorrow, layered over genuine terror. I'm sorry about your mother. Mrs. Cole, he said. Eleanor Carter was a fine woman. What happened to your family was wrong. Then help us make it right, Evelyn said. If I sign anything, he said, Voss will know. He'll know within a week. There are people who watch, who report. I have a wife, 2 children. He stopped. He was breathing faster than a man sitting still should be breathing. I've seen what he does to people who go against him. Mr. Cale, Nathan said. He'd been quiet until then, standing just inside the door, and his voice was level and not unkind. We know what he does. We know about the Hendersons east of here. We know what happened to their livestock and their barn. Robert Cale looked at him. Something flickered in his face. Recognition that he wasn't talking to someone who didn't understand the stakes. Arthur Cross is taking the case, Evelyn said. He's coming here to take your statement in person. He's done this before. He knows how to protect witnesses. Cross, Cale said. Something shifted. The lawyer from Helena. You know the name, Nathan said. Everyone in this county who works with records knows the name, Cale said. Voss has mentioned him, not kindly. He swallowed. If Cross is involved. He's involved, Evelyn said. And he told us you were the key. He said the other cases against Voss had gaps because there was no inside witness. You're the inside witness, Mr. Cale. You saw the filing. You knew it was wrong. You wrote my mother a private note rather than let it go completely. That note, that moment when you chose to warn her instead of staying silent, that matters. She paused. My mother trusted you enough to tell me about that note. She told me your name. She said if you ever find someone brave enough to listen, Robert Cale will tell the truth. Robert Cale looked at her. His eyes were wet suddenly in the way of a man who was not expecting emotion and was embarrassed by it. He looked at the wall. He looked at his hands. She said that she did. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Evelyn heard the clock on his mantelpiece counting out the seconds with the indifference of machines. Then he said, if Cross comes here himself, if he takes the statement privately before any public filing. He said he would, Nathan said. And if there's protection, some arrangement, before the case is public. We'll work with Cross on that, Evelyn said. Whatever he can arrange. Cale looked at them both. He was still frightened. He was going to be frightened for a long time, probably. But beneath the fear, she saw the thing that her mother had seen in him. The man who had written that note, instead of doing nothing. The man who had chosen to leave a thread someone could follow. That man was still in there. He'd just been living under the fear for a long time. All right, he said, very quietly. All right. When Cross is ready, tell him to come to me. They drove back to the ranch, and Evelyn wrote to Cross that afternoon, and Nathan posted the letter at first light the next day, and they settled back into the rhythm of the ranch that had over the past 3 weeks become genuinely theirs. She was up before dawn now most mornings. She'd taken over the account ledger entirely, and Nathan had stopped pretending to protest about it. The garden on the south side of the house was her project, and she'd been studying what would need to happen. Come spring, the beds cleared the soil, turned the root structure given the chance it had been waiting for. He came in one evening and found her with her hand in the dirt of a clay pot she'd set near the hearth testing something with a particular seed variety, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her before he said anything. What are you doing? Germination test, she said. If this variety takes in indoor warmth, it'll take in March soil. He came in and sat at the table and watched her with that attention that she'd stopped being able to misidentify. It was not the attention of a man observing a useful arrangement. How do you know so much about growing things? He asked. My mother again, she said. She said you could tell everything you needed to know about a piece of ground just by paying attention to what it had tried to grow without you. He was quiet for a moment. She said a lot of smart things. Constantly, Evelyn said. It was occasionally exhausting. She glanced up at him. She said something about you once. I remembered it on the ride to Billings." "What did she say?" Evelyn looked back at the pot. "She said, some people are built to go it alone, and they know it, and they're comfortable with it. And some people are built to go it with someone else, and they convince themselves otherwise, because it hurts less than wanting something they think they can't have." She paused. I was 12. I had no idea who she was talking about. Nathan was very still on the other side of the table. She didn't look at him. "I think I know now," she said. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind moved through the empty garden and rattled the loose shutter that still needed fixing on the east side of the house, and she made a note in the back of her mind to fix it tomorrow. Then Nathan said very quietly, "Evelyn." She looked up. I was looking at her with the most open expression she'd seen on his face. Yet not the guarded attention, not the almost smile, but something raw and careful and entirely undefended, as if the armor he'd been wearing for 3 years had in this particular moment simply come off. "I'm glad you put your foot in my door," he said. She held his gaze. Her chest was doing something complicated and inconvenient. "I'm glad you didn't slam it anyway," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, the real smile, and this time it didn't disappear quickly. It stayed, just for a moment, just long enough. She looked back at her germination test, and came the way the worst. Montana storms came fast and absolute, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in 2 hours, the wind shifting from the northwest with a ferocity that turned everything that had been manageable into something that wasn't. She woke to the sound of the barn door banging with a force that was going to tear it off its remaining hinge if someone didn't get to it, and she was up and pulling on her coat before she'd fully registered being awake. Nathan was already in the hallway. They looked at each other in the dark. "The horses," he said. "The barn door," she said at exactly the same moment. They went out together. What hit her when she opened the back door was a wall of cold and noise that was almost physical. The wind was coming in long, hard gusts that didn't stop between strikes, and the dark was absolute. Except for the thin beam of the lantern Nathan had grabbed from the hook by the door. She pulled her coat tighter and kept her head down and followed the light. The barn door had not torn free yet, but it was close. Nathan got to it first, and she came in beside him, and they got their hands on it together and hauled it back against the frame, and he fought the bolt down while she held the door against the wind, trying to rip it out of their grip. The bolt caught. The door held. Inside, the horses were moving in their stalls with the particular nervous energy of animals who understood that the weather outside had turned dangerous. She went to them while Nathan went to check the roof joints. She could hear something in the structure shifting in the wind, a deep groan that was the sound of old timber working against force. "Brace up there," Nathan called from the far end of the barn. He was at the northeast corner looking at the junction where the roofline met the vertical support. "This joint's been loose since September. I've been meaning to—" She heard the wood before she saw it move. The crack was loud enough to come through the wind, and she spun around in time to see the upper brace along the northeast corner give way. Not all at once, but in stages. The joint separating the weight, shifting the secondary support, taking up load. It wasn't designed to carry. And Nathan was directly beneath it, his hands up on the joint, and she was across the barn in the time it took her to understand what was happening. "Nathan, move." He moved. He pushed backward hard off the wall, and the beam came down across the space where he'd been standing and caught him across the left side. Not the full weight of it, not directly, but a glancing blow that was still enough to put him down. She heard him hit the ground. She was already there, sliding in beside him, getting her hands under his arm. "Nathan, Nathan, look at me." I was conscious. His face was tight with pain, his breath coming sharp. "I'm all right," he said. It was clearly not fully true. "Where? Left side. Ribs, maybe. I'm all right." He was already trying to get up. She put her hands on his chest. "Stop," she said. "Stop moving. Let me—" "We need to get the horses out of this corner," he said. "If that joint goes completely—" "I'll do it," she said. "Stay down." "Evelyn. Nathan." She looked him in the eyes. "I will move the horses. You will stay on the ground for the next 3 minutes. Those are the terms." "Agreed." He looked at her. He was in real pain. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the controlled way he was holding himself, but his eyes were clear and present. "Agreed," he said. She moved the horses. It took 4 minutes, not 3, because the animals were frightened, and frightened horses did not move in straight lines regardless of what you asked. She got them secured at the far end of the barn, away from the compromised joint, and then she went back to Nathan, who had in fact stayed where she'd put him, which told her the pain was worse than he was admitting. She helped him up slowly. He leaned on her without argument, which also told her something. Together they got back to the house out of the wind and the dark and the cold that had turned the night into something with teeth. Inside she got him to the chair by the fire. She got his coat off him. She examined his left side with steady hands, the way her father had taught her. He'd been a man who believed everyone in a household should know basic medical care, because in this territory, the nearest doctor was rarely near enough when you needed one. 2 ribs possibly cracked, not broken through. She bound them with the strip of linen she found in the kitchen supply drawer, and she did it efficiently, and he sat through it in silence, only his breathing betraying the degree of pain. And when it was done, she sat back and looked at him. He was looking back at her. "Thank you," he said. "You'd have had the same beam on top of you if I hadn't yelled," she said. "So we're even." "You moved the horses alone," he said. "Someone had to. In that wind, in the dark." "Nathan," she said. "Stop." He stopped. He looked at her with that open, undefended expression. Again, the one that came now, without his permission, more frequently, as if the armor was fitting less well with every week that passed. "Nobody has done that," he said. "Run toward me, in 3 years." He paused. When things went wrong, people stepped back. They always stepped back. She looked at him squarely. "I'm not people," she said. He reached out, and his hand covered hers on the arm of the chair. Not a grip, just contact. Warm and deliberate and quiet. She looked at his hand, and then she looked at his face, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing neither of us has named. She turned her hand over and held his back. The fire burned. The storm went on, throwing itself at the house from every direction. The window glass trembled in its frame. The loose shutter knocked. Outside, the Montana winter was doing everything it could. Inside, his hand was warm in hers, and neither of them let go. After a while, she said, "I need to go back out. Check the rest of the fence line on the north side when the wind drops." "Not in the dark," he said. "When the wind drops," she said. "An hour, maybe." His hand tightened slightly on hers. "Then sit here for an hour," he said. "Just sit here." She sat. The hour passed, and neither of them talked much. He asked her once about the germination test, because he was that kind of man, the kind who noticed the small things and remembered them. She told him about the seed variety, and what she thought would grow in that soil, and what her mother had said about the south-facing slope being ideal for certain hardy plants, even at this altitude. He listened with that complete attention that she'd stopped being able to take lightly. When she got up to go check the fence line, he started to get up too. She put her hand on his shoulder and pressed down gently but firmly, and he looked up at her. "You have cracked ribs," she said. "Sit." He sat. She went out. She came back in 20 minutes with the information that 2 fence posts on the north section had come down, but the cattle were still inside the shelter of the south pasture and everything critical was intact. She was covered in snow. He looked at her from the chair. She looked at him from the doorway. "She thought I came here with a letter and $31 and a practical plan that had nothing to do with any of this. She thought my mother knew exactly what she was doing. She thought so did I somewhere. Somewhere underneath the practicality. Somewhere underneath the plan." She pulled off her coat and hung it by the fire and went to make coffee, and his voice came from the chair behind her. "Evelyn." She turned. "I came because of your mother," he said. "I agreed to this because of Eleanor. I want you to know." He stopped. He tried again. "I want you to know that it's not because of Eleanor anymore." She stood with the coffee pot in her hand and looked at him by the firelight. This scarred, solitary, remarkable man who had spent 3 years convincing himself that solitude was easier than hope. She thought of what she'd told him on the ride to Billings about the practical nature of things, about being careful. She put the coffee pot down. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the hearth, close enough that the firelight was on both of them, and she said, "I came here because my mother trusted you." She paused. "I stayed because I found the man she always told me about." He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the storm hit the house with everything it had left. Inside, the fire held. He reached out again, and this time he brushed a strand of her snow-damp hair back from her face, with a care so deliberate it was barely a touch at all, and she understood that for a man who had spent 3 years certain that nobody would choose to be close to him, this was everything. "Nathan," she said quietly, "your scars didn't make you unworthy." She said it simply, like a fact. "They just showed me who was worth finding." He said nothing. But his eyes were bright, and his jaw worked once, and she watched him absorb it, really absorb it down to the place where the damage lived, and she thought she could see in the firelight the exact moment when something that had been locked for a very long time came open. He didn't smile. He did something quieter than a smile. He exhaled. Like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years and had finally in this moment been given permission to stop. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. And in the morning, Harlan Voss's man was waiting at the edge of their property with a message that changed everything. The man at the edge of their property was named Cole Decker, and he worked for Harlan Voss, the way a bad smell worked for a slaughterhouse. He was the thing that arrived before the real damage did, and everyone who knew him understood what his presence meant. Nathan saw him first from the barn where he'd gone, despite Evelyn's objections to check on the horses after the storm. His ribs were bound tight, and he moved carefully. But he was not a man who could lie in a chair while there was work to be done, and she had accepted this about him with the pragmatism of a woman who understood that some arguments were not worth the energy. She'd made him eat breakfast first. He'd gone after that, and she'd followed 10 minutes later with the mended fence wire, and that was when they both saw Decker sitting his horse at the property line, with the particular patience of a man who'd been told to wait and didn't mind being seen waiting, because being seen was the point. She put her hand on Nathan's arm. Not restraining, just present. He was already still, so it wasn't restraint, it was something else. She could feel the tension in his forearm through her palm, the controlled readiness of a man who had been expecting something like this and was not surprised it had arrived. "Decker," Nathan said loud enough to carry. Decker touched his hat. He was a lean man in his 40s, with the flat eyes of someone who had decided early in life that conscience was an inconvenience. "Morning, Cole. Mrs. Cole." He said her name with a courtesy that was entirely theatrical. "Mr. Voss asked me to pass along a message." "Then pass it," Nathan said. Decker reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He didn't write it over, he set it on top of the fence post at the property line, as if getting any closer were beneath him. "Mr. Voss is aware that you've been making inquiries," he said, "into matters that have already been settled legally through the county registry. He wants you to understand he has no ill feeling toward either of you. He considers the Carter transfer a closed matter." He paused, and the pause did exactly what it was designed to do. "He hopes you'll consider it closed as well. He's asked me to tell you that a man in your position," and here Decker's eyes moved to Nathan with a precision that was deliberate and meant to land, "has a great deal to lose if this ranch becomes the center of a legal dispute. Reputation, property value, the goodwill of neighbors." Another pause. "It would be a shame to see everything you've rebuilt come apart over a matter that's already been decided." Nathan walked to the fence post. He picked up the envelope. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Decker. "You tell Harlan Voss," he said in the quietest voice Evelyn had heard from him yet, "that I've heard his message, and he can expect our reply through Arthur Cross." Decker's flat eyes showed something then. Just a flicker of it, the adjustment that happens when a man expects an effect and doesn't get the one he planned for. "Cross," he repeated. "He knows the name," Nathan said. Decker looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him without expression. He touched his hat again, turned his horse and rode back down the road. They stood at the fence line until he was out of sight. Then Nathan opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. She read it over his shoulder. It was written in the careful legal language of a man who had access to lawyers, and what it said, stripped of the courtroom phrasing, was this: Harlan Voss was offering to purchase the coal ranch at a price that was 20% below its actual value, framed as a generous settlement, with a deadline of 2 weeks. If the offer was declined, Voss would file a counterclaim alleging that Evelyn Carter Cole had been involved in document fraud in Billings County prior to her arrival in Caldwell, which claim he had already prepared affidavits to support. She read it twice. Her hands were steady. Inside, something cold moved through her, not fear exactly, but the recognition of how far Voss was willing to go. He hadn't just anticipated their next move. He'd prepared a fabricated counterattack before they'd even made the move. "He has fake affidavits," she said. "He has people who'll sign anything he pays them to sign," Nathan said. "That means he already knew we went to the Billings registry. He has people watching the roads," Nathan said. "I suspected. Now I know." He folded the letter. His jaw was tight. "He wants this ranch. He's always wanted this ranch. The water rights on the north section are worth more than the land itself. He's been waiting for me to fail." He paused. He thought the accident was going to do it. When it didn't, he waited. When you arrived and we went to the records office, he understood the waiting was over. She looked at him. "He's trying to frighten us into accepting before Cross can file." "Yes." "Which means he knows Cross's filing would destroy him." Nathan looked at her. "Yes." She thought for a moment. The cold air worked at the space between her collar and her hair. She thought about Harlan Voss sitting somewhere warm and calculating exactly how much it would cost to break 2 people, and she thought about her mother and the grave in the frozen ground and the letter that had brought her here and everything that had happened since. "We write to Cross today," she said. "We tell him about the counter affidavits. He needs to know the full picture. He needs to move faster," Nathan said. "If Voss files first." "Cross knows that," she said. "We tell him about the deadline, 2 weeks. He'll understand what that means." She took the letter from Nathan's hand. "And we need to find out who signed those affidavits. Names. Because if they're people in this county, people who can be talked to. People who can be frightened back," Nathan said quietly. "People who can be shown that signing a false affidavit carries legal consequences of its own," she said. "Which is a different thing." He looked at her. He had that expression again, the one that lived between exasperation and admiration, and she was aware that she'd been seeing it more frequently, and that she'd stopped trying to categorize it as purely one thing. "You think faster than anyone I've ever known," he said. "I've had reason to," she said. They went inside, and she wrote to Cross while Nathan stood at the window, and she wrote 3 pages in 40 minutes, clear and specific, every fact laid out in order. The counter-affidavit threat, the 2-week deadline, the Billings surveillance deckers visit the water rights on the north section, and their likely connection to Voss's motivation. When she was done, Nathan read it through without changes, and they had it sealed and ready to post by mid-morning. He posted it himself. He rode into Caldwell with his ribs bound and his back straight, and he handed the letter to the mail writer personally, and when 2 men on the main street looked at him and then looked away, he kept his eyes forward and came home. He came in, and she was at the kitchen table with the account ledger and a second set of pages. She'd been building a timeline. Every date she could document, every name, every record they had copies of. She'd laid it out chronologically, and it covered 3 pages, and when he looked at it, he stood very still for a moment. "You've been building this for weeks," he said. "Since the first night," she said. "When you agreed to the arrangement, I started writing down everything I remembered. Everything my mother told me. Everything I saw in the county records." She looked at the pages. "Cross is going to need a full picture. I wanted it ready when he needed it." Nathan sat down across from her. He looked at the timeline. He looked at her. "Evelyn," he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "Last night," he said. "When I said it wasn't because of Eleanor anymore." He paused. He was doing the thing with the fork, except there was no fork, so he was doing it with the pen she'd set down, turning it in his fingers. "I mean it, and I need you to know that I understand what I'm asking you to think about when I say it." He paused again. You came here with a specific plan. A limited thing. 6 months. An arrangement. I'm not trying to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I would not blame you if the thing you'd planned was still the thing you wanted. When this is over. If you still want to walk away, Nathan," she said. He stopped. "Stop trying to give me permission to leave," she said. "I don't need your permission. I'll leave if I want to leave, and I'll stay if I want to stay. And what I want is not currently a question I'm uncertain about." She held his gaze. "Are you uncertain?" "No," he said. It came out immediately. No hesitation. "Then stop talking yourself out of something you already know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the pen down and reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his the way she had the night before by the fire, and they sat like that at the kitchen table with the timeline between them and the letter on its way to Arthur Cross and Harlan Voss's deadline hanging in the air, and neither of them said anything else about it. They didn't need to. Cross arrived on a Friday 12 days before Voss's deadline. He came by coach from Helena, and he was nothing like what she'd pictured from his letters. She'd imagined someone formal and distant, all legal precision and professional remove. What arrived was a stocky man of about 60, with a graying beard and a coat that had seen considerable use, and the particular energy of someone who had been angry about injustice for a long time, and had learned to run on it efficiently. He shook Nathan's hand and then looked at Evelyn with sharp gray eyes and said, "You built the timeline." "Yes," she said. "It's the best organized evidence summary I've received in 30 years of practice," he said. "And I've had some good ones." She felt something warm in her chest. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." Cross spread across their kitchen table for 3 hours. He went through every document, asked questions that were precise and unexpected, pushed back on 3 of her date assumptions, and was right about 2 of them, and told Nathan with the directness of a man who didn't traffic in false reassurance that the counter-affidavit threat was serious and would need to be addressed head-on. "He'll have 3 or 4 names," Cross said. "People he's used before, men who'll sign what they're told." He looked at Nathan. "Do you know who he uses?" "I can make a fair guess," Nathan said. He named 2 names. Cross wrote them down. "I've seen both those signatures before," he said. "On a land transfer in Park County, 1883. False witness attestation." He looked up. "If they've signed for him before, and I can prove it, their signatures become worthless the moment I introduce the pattern. Voss knows this. He's counting on you not knowing their history." "Can you prove it?" Evelyn asked. "I have the Park County filing," Cross said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been building a case for 2 years. "I came here with everything I have, Mrs. Cole. This is not a case I'm picking up cold." She felt the weight of that. The 2 years of preparation. The other families who hadn't gone the distance. The cases that had settled before they'd gotten this far. "The dead witness," she said. "Gerald Finch. That's the center." "That's the center," Cross confirmed. "A forged witness signature from a dead man documented by certified death record compared against a valid original deed that predates the transfer by 6 years. That's not a gray area. That's fraud. Clear, documentable, prosecutable fraud." He looked at them both. "But Voss is going to make the next 2 weeks very uncomfortable. He's going to push. I want you prepared for that." "What kind of pushing?" Nathan asked. "The kind he's done before," Cross said. "To the Henderson family it was livestock. To the Morley family 3 years ago it was a fire." He said it plainly without trying to soften it. "He escalates to match the threat level. We are a very significant threat level." The room was quiet for a moment. Nathan looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. "What do we do?" she said. "You document everything," Cross said. "Every visit from Decker or anyone like him. Every piece of property that moves, breaks, or goes missing. Every conversation that feels like a warning. You write it down with the date and time, and you send me a copy within 24 hours. He paused. "And you don't go anywhere alone, either of you." She nodded. Nathan nodded. Cross went to Robert Cale that afternoon. Nathan drove him. She stayed at the ranch because Cross had asked for it that way. Cale was frightened, and too many people at once would make him worse. She sat at the kitchen table and did the account ledger, and tried not to think about what was happening in Robert Cale's small house on the edge of Caldwell. They were back in 2 hours. Cross came in with the expression of a man who had gotten what he came for. He sat down and looked at both of them. Cale signed, he said. Full affidavit. He was frightened. He's still frightened, but he signed. Evelyn closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. Good, she said. He told me something else, Cross said. Something he didn't put in the letter to your mother. He looked at her carefully. There was a second filing. After the Carter transfer. Voss transferred a portion of the Carter land again 6 months after the initial transfer to a third party. A company called Meridian Land Holdings. He paused. Meridian Land Holdings is Voss. It's a shell. He moved the land through a second entity to obscure the trail, and then he used Meridian as collateral for a significant bank loan. Nathan looked at her. She looked at him. So there's a bank involved, she said. A bank in St. Paul, Cross said. And they hold a note against land that was acquired through fraud. Which means when this case resolves, the bank is going to have questions of their own. He let that sit. This is bigger than one fraudulent transfer, Mrs. Cole. Voss has been running a land acquisition scheme across 3 counties. Your mother's ranch is one piece of it. If I pull this thread, pull it, she said. Cross looked at her steadily. You understand what that means. This becomes a larger case. There will be more exposure, more pressure on you both. It may take longer. Pull the thread, Mr. Cross, she said. My mother deserves the whole truth out in the light, not just the piece of it that was done to her. Cross looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Evelyn. Then he looked at Cross. You heard her, he said. Cross nodded slowly. Then I'll file on Monday, he said. Before Voss's deadline. We file first, we control the timeline. He closed his case and stood up. I'll be at the Caldwell boarding house through the weekend. If anything happens, anything at all, send word immediately. She walked him to the door. He paused before he went out and looked at her with those sharp gray eyes. Mrs. Cole, he said. Your mother was right to send you to him, and he was right to open the door. He said it quietly, not for Nathan to hear. Don't let anything Voss does in the next 2 weeks make you forget that. She looked at the man for a moment. She usually was right, she said. Cross almost smiled. Remarkable woman, he said. And he went out to the wagon. She stood in the doorway and watched it drive away, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not the careful, managed hope she'd been carrying since Billings, not the working confidence of strategy and preparation, but something older and more fundamental than those things. Something that was closest to the feeling she'd had at 7 years old, sitting in the Carter kitchen, watching her mother move through the world, like someone who understood that hard things were survivable if you went at them straight. She stood there until the wagon was out of sight. Then she went back inside. Nathan was standing in the middle of the kitchen, and he'd put the coffee back on, and he was looking at her with that expression, still open, still unguarded, the armor that fit less well every week. He said, "How are you doing?" It was such a plain question, such a quiet, ordinary personal question, not about the case or Cross or Voss. How are you doing? She thought about it honestly. Better than I expected, she said. Scared in the specific way you're scared when the thing you've been afraid of is finally in motion, and there's nothing left to do but see it through. He nodded. He poured the coffee, and he slid her cup across the counter, and he said, "That's the worst kind of scared, when the action is over and the waiting begins." "You've felt it," she said. "Every day for about a week after the accident," he said. "When I didn't know yet what the leg was going to do, whether it would hold." He paused. It held, mostly. She picked up her cup. She looked at him. "Nathan, what Cross said, about Voss escalating to match the threat level." She paused. "I want you to know that I am not going to let what he might do be a reason to pull back. But I also need you to know that I am not going to be careless about it. If I think something is moving wrong, I will tell you, immediately." "And I'll tell you," he said. "No more managing the situation alone," she said. "No more," he agreed. He said it like a man who understood the full weight of what he was agreeing to, Not just strategically, but in every other way as well. The man who had run his mother off to Bozeman because he didn't want to be watched while he hurt. The man who had gone a year suspecting his feed contract was wrong without telling anyone because there was no one to tell. No more. She held his gaze. "Good," she said. They heard the first sign of escalation on Sunday evening. Billy Marsh, whose family ran a small farm 2 miles north, came riding in fast, just before dark, with the look of someone who had been thinking hard about whether to come at all, and had decided at the last moment that he had to. He was 19, long and angular, with his father's coloring and his mother's habit of looking sideways when he was about to say something difficult. "Mr. Cole," he said, still on his horse, "I don't want trouble with nobody, but I thought you ought to know. 3 men came to my father this afternoon. I didn't hear all of it, but I heard enough. They were telling him that if he gave a testimony in any court matter involving your family, there'd be consequences for the Marsh farm." He swallowed. "My father told them to get off his property. But—" "Was your father planning to give testimony?" Nathan asked. Billy hesitated. "He was going to tell the truth if anyone asked him," he said carefully. "About some things he saw at the county records office. About Peterson and a man who came in with Voss back in the spring." He looked at Nathan steadily. "He's not going to stop telling the truth just because some men came to the farm." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Tell your father I'm grateful," he said. "And tell him to write down everything that happened today. Names, descriptions, what was said, date and time. He can bring it to me or send it to the lawyer Cross in Caldwell." Billy nodded. He turned his horse. Then he stopped. He looked back. "Mr. Cole, my father said to tell you he said you were never the man people said you were after the accident. He said he was sorry it took this long to say so out loud." Nathan stood at the edge of the porch, and he didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was steady. "Thank you, Billy." Billy rode off into the dark. She came to stand beside Nathan on the porch. The night was cold and clear, the storm of the week before gone, completely, the sky enormous and full of stars. "He's intimidating witnesses," she said. "He's getting desperate," Nathan said. "Cross-filing Monday changed the calculation. He's trying to seal off every route." "He can't seal them all," she said. "No," Nathan said. He was looking at the sky. "Billy Marsh's father was never a friend of mine. We were barely neighbors. He looked away when people talked about me, the same as most of them." He paused. "But he came. He sent his boy in the dark to warn us." She understood what he was feeling. She'd felt the same thing when Mrs. Hannigan had leaned over the counter in the dry goods store. The surprise of it, the disorienting reality that people you hadn't expected were quietly choosing sides. "They're watching you," she said. "They've been watching since we went to the records office together. They're deciding what kind of people you are." "What kind of people we are," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her, and the starlight did what starlight did to faces when there was no other light. It simplified them, stripped away everything provisional, and left only the essential. And what she saw on his face was not complicated at all. She took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers. "We file Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. Cross filed at 9 in the morning. By noon the news had moved through Caldwell. The way news in small towns always moved, faster than horses, slower than wildfire, and with a carrying power that nothing else matched. By 2 in the afternoon, Peterson had locked his office and hadn't been seen. By 4, Harlan Voss's counterfiling, the one with the fake affidavits against Evelyn, had arrived at the courthouse, but it arrived 3 hours after Cross's filing, which meant it arrived second. Which meant, in the eyes of the law, it arrived as a response to a case already in motion. Cross had anticipated this. The counterfiling didn't stop anything. It became instead part of the record. Cross sent a rider to the ranch at 5 o'clock with a single sentence: "We are on the ground. Stand firm." Nathan read it, handed it to Evelyn. She read it, handed it back. He pinned it to the wall beside the kitchen window, which surprised her. She looked at it there, that short sentence in Cross's compact handwriting, and then she looked at Nathan. "So we can see it," he said simply. She nodded. 3 days after the filing. Two of Voss's fence posts on the boundary of what had been Carterland were found painted with the Cole brand. It was a clear, deliberate provocation, a challenge to Nathan to respond physically to do something that could be characterized as aggression. Nathan looked at the posts. He turned to Evelyn. "We document it," he said. "Yes," she said. "We don't touch them." "No." They wrote it down. Date, time, description, location. They sent a copy to Cross. The painted posts stayed where they were. 2 days after that, Dan at the supply house refused to extend their monthly account, an arrangement Nathan had maintained for 4 years without a late payment. Dan looked at the counter when he said it and wouldn't meet Nathan's eyes. Nathan looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to Evelyn. "We'll settle in cash going forward," she said to Dan. Pleasantly, clearly. "Please issue a full accounting of the current balance so we can close it out." Dan issued the accounting. They paid it. They left. On the road back, Nathan said, he got to Dan. "Yes," she said. "That's the economic pressure," he said. "He'll try to cut off enough of our business relationships that the ranch becomes unviable." "He can try," she said. "I've been looking at the accounts. We can manage without Dan's supply house for a month, maybe 6 weeks. By then, Cross will have the first court date scheduled, and Voss is going to have considerably bigger problems than whether we're buying feed in Caldwell." Nathan rode in silence for a moment. Then he said, "You've been calculating this already." "I calculate constantly," she said. "It's a character flaw." Haimada a sound that was almost a laugh. She'd been collecting the almost laughs, the almost smiles. She had a growing catalog of them, and she kept adding to it without meaning to. "Nathan," she said, "I want to go into town on Saturday. Not for supplies, not for the case. I want to walk down the main street with you, and I want to go to the hotel dining room for supper where everyone can see us, and I want to look like two people who are not losing." He was quiet. "Because we're not losing," she said. "And I want Voss's people to look at us and take that back to him." He looked at the road. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not the almost smile, but was related to it something larger and more reckless. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. They came into Caldwell on Saturday evening as the lamps were being lit in the shop windows, and they walked down the main street together. Nathan's stride with its slight drag that she had long since stopped hearing as anything other than his particular rhythm, and she walked beside him without the self-consciousness of the early weeks, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. People looked. People always looked. But something was different this time. Mrs. Hannigan, emerging from her store as they passed, stopped and said quite loudly, "Good evening to you both." Across the street, a man Nathan apparently knew from years back lifted his hat without hesitation. An older woman near the hotel entrance nodded with the particular deliberateness of someone making a statement. Nathan noticed. She felt it through his arm, a slight adjustment, a straightening, something that wasn't pride exactly, but was the older, quieter cousin of it. In the hotel dining room, they sat at a table near the window, and they ordered supper, and they were seen. And halfway through the meal, a man stopped at their table. He was in his 60s. Silver-haired with the look of someone who carried authority without needing to announce it. He held his hat in both hands. He looked at Nathan, and then at Evelyn, and then at Nathan again. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I'm George Alderman. You won't know me well, but I know you. I've known your family for 20 years. He paused. "When the accident happened, I believed what people said. I kept my distance. I was wrong to do that, and I want to say so plainly." Nathan looked at the man. He said nothing for a moment. She could see him deciding what to do with this, the unexpected weight of a public apology from a man he'd probably watched walk past him for 3 years. "I appreciate that," Nathan said, quietly, meaning it. Alderman nodded. He looked at Evelyn. "What you're doing going up against Voss, I want you to know there are people in this valley who've wanted to see it happen for a long time." He paused. "You're not alone in this. I want you to know that." He put his hat back on and walked away. Nathan looked at his plate. He was doing the thing where he held himself very still because something had gotten past the guard and he was managing it. She watched him and did not say anything and let him have the moment. After a while he said without looking up, "I didn't expect that." "People surprise you," she said, "when you give them the chance." He looked up. His eyes were very dark in the lamplight and very clear. "You gave them the chance," he said. "You walked into this county, and you went to that records office, and you didn't hide, and you didn't apologize, and you made it impossible for people to keep looking away." She shook her head. "You did that," she said. "I just walked beside you." He looked at her steadily. "Evelyn," he said. "Nathan," she said back. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers on the white tablecloth in the hotel dining room in Caldwell, Montana, in full sight of every person in that room, and he did not look around to check who was watching. She turned her hand over. She held his back. Outside, the Montana winter was beginning at its margins to soften. The cold was still hard, but it was no longer absolute. Somewhere in the soil of the South Garden, the root structure that had been waiting for years for someone to notice it was doing what patient things did. It was beginning. The first court date was set for the 3rd week of February, and the weeks between Monday's filing and that date were the longest weeks of Evelyn's life. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened in the particular grinding way that legal battles happened, which was slowly and with enormous amounts of paper, and very few moments where you could feel the ground solidly beneath your feet. Cross worked from the Caldwell boarding house and sent riders to the ranch every 2 or 3 days with updates that were precise and clinical and told her what she needed to know without telling her what she wanted to know, which was whether it was going to be enough. Whether Gerald Finch's death record and Robert Cale's affidavit and the certified Carter deed from Billings and the pattern of false attestation signatures that Cross had documented across 3 counties were going to be enough to bring down a man who had spent a decade making himself untouchable. She didn't ask Cross that question directly. She understood that lawyers who answered that question directly were either dishonest or foolish, and Cross was neither. She asked Nathan instead one night when the fire was low and the account ledger was closed, and she was sitting across from him at the table where they'd sat together so many evenings now that she'd stopped counting them. "Do you think it'll hold?" she said. He looked at her. He understood what she was asking. "I think Cross doesn't lose cases he decides to fight," he said. "And I think Voss knows that, which is why he's running scared." "He doesn't look scared," she said. "Scared men rarely do," Nathan said. "They look aggressive, they push harder, they make more noise." He paused. "The painting on the fence posts, pulling Dan's supply credit, sending men to the Marsh farm. That's not the behavior of a man who thinks he's going to win. That's the behavior of a man who's running out of moves and knows it." She turned that over. She wanted to believe it. She was honest enough with herself to know that wanting to believe something and being able to rely on it were different things, and she held the distinction carefully. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens with the case," she said, "I want you to know that I haven't thought of this as temporary for a long time." He was very still. "I know I came here with 6 months in mind," she said. "I know the arrangement had a shape to it. I'm telling you the shape changed." She held his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere. Not when this is over. Not after the ruling. Not ever unless you ask me to. And I don't think you're going to ask me to." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved through several things, the guarded reflex, the controlled response, and then passed both of them to something that was entirely unmanaged and entirely his. "No," he said. "I'm not going to ask you to." She nodded. He nodded back. And they sat with it the way they sat with everything that mattered most in the particular quiet of 2 people who had stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. The night before the first court hearing, Cross came to the ranch for supper. It was the first time he'd been to the house rather than the boarding house, and he sat at their kitchen table with his coat off and his case papers spread out, and he ate Evelyn's stew with the appreciation of a man who spent too much time eating boarding house food, and he talked them through what the next morning would look like with the directness she'd come to depend on. "Voss will be there," Cross said, "with his lawyers. He'll have 2 of them, maybe 3. They're going to argue that the witness date discrepancy is a clerical error, which is the only argument they have left, and they know it's weak. They're going to attack the chain of evidence on the Billings deed, which is also weak because Miss Ellard at the registry is unimpeachable, and they're going to attempt to introduce the counter-affidavits against you. He looked at Evelyn. I'm going to move to have those struck on the basis of the established false attestation pattern. The judge will likely grant it. Likely, she said. Judges make their own decisions, Cross said. I don't promise outcomes. I promise preparation. He paused. The alderman depositions came in this afternoon. She looked up. George Alderman. And 4 others, Cross said. After Alderman spoke to you at the hotel, he went to 4 other ranchers in the valley and asked them to give formal statements about what they'd seen and heard regarding Voss's operations over the past 5 years. 2 of them had their own stories. 1 had documentation. He set a stack of papers on the table. Alderman did this on his own. I didn't ask him. I didn't know until the papers arrived. Nathan was very quiet. She looked at him and saw on his face the same thing she'd felt when Billy Marsh had ridden in at dusk, the disorienting surprise of the unexpected ally. The people who'd been watching and deciding and had finally decided. He did that himself, Nathan said. He did, Cross said. He looked at Nathan steadily. There are more people in this valley on your side than you've known. They weren't visible until now. They're visible now. Nathan looked at the stack of depositions. He didn't say anything. She reached under the table and found his hand, and he held on without looking away from the papers. Cross left after supper, and they cleaned up the kitchen together, the way they'd been doing for weeks, moving around each other in the easy, wordless way of people who had learned each other's rhythms without trying to. And when the last dish was done, he put his hand on the back of her neck very gently, and she leaned back against him for just a moment, and neither of them said anything about it. She slept better that night than she'd slept since November. The courthouse in Caldwell was a single-story building that smelled of pine and cold air and the particular gravity of rooms where consequential things were decided. It was full by 9 in the morning. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected Cross and Nathan and Voss's lawyers, and the judge, and perhaps a dozen people with direct interest in the proceedings. What she found was a room that had run out of chairs, with people standing along the back wall and in the doorway, and more outside, who hadn't gotten in. She stood for a moment in the entrance and looked at the room. Nathan stood behind her. They all came, she said. They all came, he said. She walked in. He walked beside her. And the room noticed, she felt it, the shift in attention, the heads turning. But it didn't feel the way the attention in town had felt in those early weeks, the measuring and the doubt. It felt like something else. Something that was closer to witness. Harlan Voss was already seated at the opposite table. She looked at him for the first time. How was not what she'd imagined either. She'd built a picture of him from the damage he'd done the missing land, the forged documents, the men he'd sent to farms in the night to deliver threats, and that picture had a certain scale to it. The man at the table was around 55, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in the way of men who considered presentation to be a form of argument. He had a rancher's hands and a businessman's eyes, and he looked at her with the flat assessment of someone taking a measurement. She looked back at him without blinking. He looked away first. She sat down. Nathan sat beside her. Cross arranged his papers. The judge came in. What followed was 4 hours of the most concentrated attention Evelyn had ever paid to anything in her life. She had not known before Cross that legal proceedings had a rhythm to them, that arguments built on each other, the way structures were built. Foundation first, then weight-bearing walls, then the roof that made the whole thing hold. She watched Cross work with the admiration of someone who recognized craftsmanship in someone else's field. The dead witness landed exactly as Cross had said it would. He presented Gerald Finch's certified death record first, then the transfer document with Finch's witness signature, dated a year after his death, and he let the silence in the room do the work that no argument needed to do. The judge looked at the 2 documents for a very long time. Voss's lawyer attempted the clerical error argument. Cross produced 3 additional county records from Voss filings showing the same notary, the same format, the same chain of processing. A pattern, Cross said, is not a clerical error. A pattern is a practice. The counter-affidavits against Evelyn were introduced, and Cross moved immediately to strike them, presenting his Park County documentation showing both signatories' signatures on a false attestation from 1883. The judge examined it. He struck the counter-affidavits. Voss at the other table was very still. She watched him without being obvious about it. She watched him understand over the course of those 4 hours that the architecture he'd built over a decade was coming down around him, and that there was nothing in his remaining arguments capable of stopping it. Robert Cale took the witness position just after noon. He was still frightened. She could see it in the way he sat, the slight tension in his shoulders, the deliberate control of his voice. But he was there. He'd come. And when Cross asked him to describe what he'd observed at the county records office in the spring of 1886, he described it. Clearly. Completely. Without looking at Voss. When Voss's lawyer cross-examined him and suggested his memory might be unreliable, Robert Cale looked at the lawyer with the expression of a man who had been frightened for a long time and had gotten tired of it, and he said, "My memory is not unreliable. I remember everything that happens in that office. It is my job to remember." And then he said quietly, "And I remember that what I saw was wrong. I've known it was wrong for 2 years. I should have said so sooner." The room was very quiet after that. The judge recessed for 30 minutes. Cross came back to their table. He didn't say anything. He poured water from the pitcher and drank it and organized papers. He didn't need to organize, and she understood that this was what he did when he was waiting. He kept his hands busy, and he didn't make promises. When the judge returned, he spoke for 11 minutes. She held Nathan's hand under the table through all 11 of them. The transfer was fraudulent. The Carter land deed was valid and superseded all subsequent filings. Harlan Voss was ordered to appear before the court in 30 days to face charges related to document fraud, false attestation, and filing of fraudulent county records. The matter of the Meridian Land Holdings Shell Company and the St. Paul bank note was referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation. The Carter land was restored to the Carter estate, which meant to Evelyn. She heard the words. She heard them twice, because Cross quietly repeated the ruling's key points for her afterward, and she sat at that table in the Caldwell courthouse and let it happen. The thing she'd been working toward since November, since her mother's grave, since $31, and a letter and a wagon ride north into the worst winter in a decade. Nathan's hand tightened on hers. She turned and looked at him, and his face was doing something she'd never seen it do. Entirely undone. Entirely open. Every careful layer gone. Just the man himself, looking at her with eyes that were bright and steady and completely unguarded. She thought, "My mother. She thought you knew exactly what you were doing. She thought so did I." She put her other hand over his. The room around them was loud. She could hear it distantly. The reaction of people who had watched and waited and were now responding to what they'd seen. But inside the small space between the two of them, it was perfectly quiet. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. Cross shook their hands. Alderman found them near the door and shook Nathan's hand for a long time and said things that Nathan received with the slight difficulty of a man who was still learning how to let people in, but he received them. He didn't deflect. He didn't close off. He stood there and let George Alderman say what he'd come to say, and he said thank you, and he meant it. Mrs. Hannigan hugged Evelyn in the corridor, which was so unexpected that Evelyn laughed, and Mrs. Hannigan laughed too, and said something about that rotten man Voss getting what was coming to him since before anybody could remember. Billy Marsh's father found them outside and said quietly that he hoped there were no hard feelings for the years of distance. Nathan told him there were none. He meant that too. She watched him. Meenet watched him choose it deliberately and without reservation, and she thought, that is what it looks like when a person decides they're done carrying the weight of other people's failures. It looked like him standing in the cold outside the Caldwell courthouse, shaking a neighbor's hand and looking at the man directly. They drove home in the late afternoon, and for a long time neither of them said anything, which was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said everything that needed saying, and were now simply together in the aftermath of a hard thing completed. Halfway home, Nathan said, "The Carter land." She looked at him. "It's yours now," he said. "Legally, officially restored. What are you going to do with it?" She'd been thinking about this for weeks in the back of her mind in the hours before sleep. She'd turned it over the way she turned everything over, practically completely from every direction. "I'd like to work it," she said. "Not alone. I can't manage 240 acres and this ranch at the same time alone." She paused. "I'd like to work it with you, if you're willing." He looked at the road. "That's a significant operation," he said, "combined with the coal land." "Yes," she said. "It would take years to develop properly." "Yes," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm willing," he said. Then after a pause, with the small, careful deliberateness of a man who chose his words when they mattered, "I'm more than willing." She looked at him. He looked at her. And the wagon went on down the road toward home. The Carter land became something in the spring. Cross handled the formal transfer of the deed through the county. A new clerk had been appointed after Peterson resigned in February, 2 days before Voss's fraud charges were formally filed. And on the first warm day of March, Evelyn walked the Carter property for the first time as its legal owner, with Nathan beside her, and the particular silence of land that had been waiting. She stood on the ground where her father had stood, and her mother after him, and she put her hand flat against the fence post at the property's edge, and she held it there for a long moment, and she said quietly, "We're back." Nathan stood a few feet away, giving her the space for it, but close enough that she could have reached him in 2 steps. She turned and looked at him in the March light. This man with his scar and his uneven gait, and his grandmother's ring on her finger, and his careful hands, and the way he listened, like the world's most important thing was whatever she was saying. She looked at all of it, and she felt in her chest the particular completeness of something that had traveled a long way to arrive exactly here. She found her mother's letter that evening, not the original. She knew where the original was, folded in the small box on the dresser in their room. The box that also held the first ledger page she'd corrected with the feed supply numbers, and a dried flower from the garden's first March growth. She found a second letter. She hadn't known there was a second one. It had been folded inside the lining of the small suitcase she'd brought from Billings, tucked into a seam she hadn't examined, and she only found it because the lining was beginning to separate, and she'd been meaning to mend it. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Her mother's handwriting. Shakier than the first letter, which meant it was later, meant Eleanor Carter had written this one when she had less time than she thought, and was making sure she'd said everything. She read it. Then she sat very still for a long moment. Then she went downstairs. Nathan was at the workbench, mending something. He was always mending something. It was one of the things she'd come to love about him, the way he couldn't stand a broken thing left unaddressed, and he looked up when she came in. He saw her face. He put down the work. "What happened?" he said. She sat across from him at the table. She put the letter down between them. "My mother wrote a second letter," she said. "I just found it." He looked at the letter. "What does it say?" She looked at it herself for a moment. Then she read it to him. "Evelyn, if you found this, you went. I knew you would. You are more like me than you've ever admitted, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. I want to tell you something I should have said out loud while I still could. The right man will not make you feel protected because he is strong. He will make you feel protected because he lets you stand beside him. He will be the man who does not shrink from you. He will be the man who grows larger when you are next to him, not smaller. Nathan Cole is that man. He was when he was 20 years old, and he walked away from a kindness without looking back because he didn't want credit. And he is still. I know this the way I know the South Garden in March. Not because it shows me everything, but because I have paid attention long enough to know what is underneath. Evelyn paused. Her voice was steady. You will not be doing what I asked you to do if you go there and do only the practical thing. You will be doing what I asked you to do if you stay. So stay, my love. Stay and grow things. You are very good at growing things. The kitchen was entirely silent. Nathan looked at the letter on the table. He looked at it for a long time. She watched him read it from where she'd said it, his eyes moving over her mother's words, and she watched the thing that moved through his face, not one emotion, but all of them, the way a river carried everything at once. He looked up. She knew, he said. She always knew, Evelyn said. She just wanted me to find out for myself. I was quiet. Then he said, I grew larger. He said it half to himself, like he was testing the truth of it. When you came, he stopped. You did, she said, simply. You went back to town. You stopped hiding your scar. You shook Alderman's hand in the street, and you meant the gratitude, and you let people see you mean it. You let Billy Marsh's father say what he came to say. She looked at him steadily. You let me in. That first night when you opened the door and I put my foot in the frame. She paused. You were going to close it. And you didn't. He looked at her with the open face she'd stopped being surprised by weeks ago. Open all the way. Nothing behind a door. I knew, he said, when I saw your eyes. You looked at me the way my grandmother said to wait for. She felt the ring on her hand. She felt the weight of the letter. She felt the March wind working at the window she'd been meaning to reglaze since January, and hadn't gotten to yet, because there was always something, and the list was long, and the ranch was alive with demands, and she loved every single one of them. She reached across the table and held his face in both hands and looked at him. My mother chose you for me, she said. And I choose you for myself. Every day from now until there are no more days. That is not an arrangement. That is not a plan. That is the truest thing I have ever said. Nathan Cole, who had not smiled, not fully, not completely, not all the way in 3 years, smiled. It started at the corner of his mouth, the place she'd been watching since November, and it moved across his face the way the first real warmth moved across the land in March, slowly, then completely, then in a way that made the time before, it seemed like something that had only existed to make this moment possible. He put his hands over hers, still on his face, and he held them there. Stay, he said, and grow things. I intend to, she said. Outside the south garden was doing exactly what her mother had known it would do. The root structure that had waited through 3 years of neglect and one long hard winter was pushing through the March soil with the particular stubbornness of living things that refused to be finished. The first green was barely visible. It would be more tomorrow, more the day after that, inside by the firelight. The man who had spent 3 years, certain that the world had moved past him, held the hands of the woman who had driven 200 miles in a Montana winter, because a dying woman's last wish had known something that neither of them had known yet, and he held on. And she held back, and neither of them let go. Not that evening, not the next morning, not ever again. A wounded heart. It turned out did not need the wound erased. It needed only one thing, the right person standing close enough and steady enough and brave enough to say, I see all of it. I see the scar and the limp and the 3 years of locked doors and the grandmother's ring you saved for someone who looked at your eyes first. I see all of it. And I am not going anywhere. Evelyn Carter. Cole looked at her husband in the firelight of the home that was now without condition or deadline or arrangement, entirely hers. And Nathan Cole finally, completely, and without apology, smiled.